I want to discuss is the brick texture, and this texture can be used to add a procedural texture by literally producing bricks. So if you're trying to create a brick wall or a brick floor, this is a very quick way to get some nice bricks for your scene. We'll demonstrate this using a cube so it's easier to see, or maybe a plane so that it's easier to see. Okay, so you can see here, looks a lot better on a plane, and we can play around with the settings here to get the desired result that we're trying to achieve. You can change the color and the scale of the brick texture depending on what you're trying to create. But yeah, it's pretty simple to get a nice brick texture in a very quick amount of time. You can play around with the frequency of how the rows consist and how they're squished. And yeah. Okay, the next texture I want to discuss is the checker texture image or node. And this is kind of like the brick texture, but it's used to add a checkerboard texture. So again, it kind of works the same as the brick texture. And if you're trying to create a floor, you know, maybe like a flooring that has a checker board, this is a really quick way to achieve that result. Oh, and you can also change the colors. The next texture I want to discuss is the environment texture node. This node must be activated inside of the world settings, which you'll see me do in a few minutes here. But basically this allows you to import an environment texture into your scene, which is pretty cool. So here's where you can find the image textures. There are a lot of different places you can find these, but this is one resource that I like to use, and it's completely free to download these HDRIs. There's a lot of them to choose from, so depending on the environment you're trying to create, you could choose whatever you're interested in. But it looks like I just went with the studio texture up here for demonstration purposes. So all you have to do is go ahead and just download it, and it'll go straight to your computer. And I'll also show you how to import this texture into Blender. It's pretty simple, so all we have to do is go ahead and go ahead and open up that environment texture again, and then we can simply just open it up from here, from wherever we saved it on our computer. You can also just drag and drop it, and I'll also demonstrate that as well. I'm going to change my settings to the world view settings now, and it'll work a lot better here. So now we can go ahead and select the texture that we downloaded. And we'll have to change our view from this view to the render view. So we're going to go up here to the top and go ahead and change that. And now our environment texture has been populated. And it's going to affect the lighting of our mesh, so you could see the shadows and the lighting is being directly influenced by the environment, which is pretty cool. We can also change the strength of the background if we want it to be lighter or darker. The next tool I'm going to discuss is the gradient texture node. All we have to do to activate this is to simply plug it in our surface, and you can see it generated here. The gradient texture node generates interpolated color and intensity values based on the input vector, and that's determined on the type of input that we select. Ideally, we would want to use a texture coordinate node to control the input, and I'll demonstrate that in a few seconds here. This works really well if you have a texture that has like an ombre effect, or a shadow, a texture that has like a shadow or a shadow effect. So I'm plugging in the texture coordinate to demonstrate how it would work with that. So basically the types of properties are the linear, which directly outputs the input x coordinate. The quadratic interpolates the x coordinate quadratically. And then there's easing, which uses a combination of quadratic and linear interpolation to generate a smooth gradient effect. Then there's a diagonal, which averages the x and y coordinates, and then there's a spherical, which creates an inverse gradient. So the next texture I want to discuss is the image texture. So I'm just going to go ahead and search for that here. And basically it literally adds an image file to your texture. So if you're making a mesh that has, if you want to have a mesh that has an image texture, then this is another way to achieve that. And I'm going to pull up a website to show you where you can find image textures to import directly into Blender. So this is a website called textures.com. It's also completely free. All you have to do is make an account and you can find a whole bunch of free textures. So I'm going to click on the library and I'm just going to search for something over here. Looks like we found a brick texture, but you can use any texture you want, depending on the scene you're trying to create. So I'm just going to find a brick texture to use to demonstrate how this works. It looks like I decided to go with this one. Now we're going to import that back into our scene and open it up. So I'm going to select it from here, and I'm just going to simply drag it into the surface material. And as you can see, the texture has generated here. And to change the scale and the coordinates of this, we can input a texture coordinate node to change the direction and, the scaling of this. And that will just give us a little bit more control over the texture. Here's how it looks on the cube. So to demonstrate that, we'll select the texture coordinate node, then we'll also select the mapping node. And this will help us better demonstrate how this works. We'll want to make sure we put this inside of the UV texture coordinate so that it's reflected off of the UV map. And then we can come down here to the scale and change the scaling of the texture. So again, this probably works really well if you're making like a building or a wall that has like a brick texture or any kind of texture. It works really well with that. But I demonstrated on all of the models here for you. We can also change the interpolation. There's a linear interpolation, a cubic interpolation, and this helps create smoother and better quality interpolations. This is great for bump maps to get better results. The next one I have to discuss is the Magic Texture node. This one is used to add a psychedelic color texture. The texture coordinate, you can use the texture coordinate to sample it, and I'll demonstrate that as well. Basically, you can change the scale of the texture, and you can change the amount of distortion, and this creates a nice effect. The next texture is the Musgrave texture node. This node evaluates a fractal Perlin noise at the input texture coordinates. Unlike the noise texture, it's also a fractal Perlin noise. The Musgrave texture allows greater control over how octaves are combined. This is great for creating like rough surfaces that have a lot of noise in them, like maybe snow or dirt. We can play around with the vectors and the scale and the amount of detail. You can see here that I'm adding a bump map to help give this a little bit more height information. Okay, so that's the result we can achieve with this. So if you're trying to create some kind of like dirt or snow or water even, you can achieve some pretty cool results using just this one node. There's also different types of Musgrave textures. There's a fractal Brownian motion, which produces an unnatural result, a homogeneous and isotropic result. Then there's a multifractional type of Musgrave texture, which looks more like a real terrain. So if you're creating a dirt texture or a ground texture, it looks pretty cool for that. If you're trying to create peaks and valleys, the hybrid multifactorial texture comes in handy. So if you're creating like landscapes or mountains and stuff like that, it really works well with that. If you're creating more of a sharper peak, then there's the ridged multifractional texture. And then there's a terrain texture, which is great for creating rivers or like land masses of water. So here I'm just demonstrating the different types of Musgrave textures. Here's a demonstration of different Musgrave types. So again, if you're trying to create a terrain texture or like a mud texture or a ground or a snow texture, this really comes in handy for those types. There's also the noise texture node. This node evaluates a fractal Perlin noise at the input texture coordinate. The inputs are dynamic, and they become available if needing depending on the node properties. I'll demonstrate how it looks here by inputting it into our color node here. We can change the scale to get a different result, and we can change the amount of detail and the amount of roughness. The roughness will blend between a smoother noise pattern and a rougher noise pattern with sharper peaks. Okay, so I have applied the sky texture here to my world settings, and we can play around with the properties. The first one is called Prethem, and we can play around with the direction of the lighting to get the desired result. Then there's one called Hosek/Wilkie, and we can adjust the strength of this texture as well. And the next type is called Nishita. The next texture I'll discuss is the Voronoi texture node, and I'll plug this into my base color to demonstrate it. This node evaluates a whirly nose at the endpoint texture coordinate. We can adjust the scale of the noise and the smoothness of the noise. We can also adjust the randomness of the noise. I'll also demonstrate this using a height map by selecting a bump map here and connecting it to my height and my distance. We can play around with the strength to get a result that we're looking for. There are different types of metrics that can be used to compute the texture. There's the Euclidean distance metric, there's the Manhattan, there's the Chebyshev, and then there's the Minkowski. These all have a different effect on the texture, which will produce a different distance. Here's an example of a hammered metal texture that was created using this shader. The next texture I'll discuss is the wave node texture. This texture adds a procedural bands or rings with noise distortion. I'll demonstrate it here using a bump map node. And I'll connect it to my height channel to demonstrate the effect. I'll select a plane to get a better demonstration. Here's an example of how this node can be used. The last texture I'll discuss is the white noise node, texture node. It returns a random number based on an input seed. The seed can be a number, a 2D vector, a 3D vector, or a 4D vector. The inputs are dynamic, and they become available if needing, depending on the node properties. I'll demonstrate this using a bump map and a mapping node and a texture coordinate node. As you can see here, it has changed the noise pattern of our texture. We can adjust the strength to get a more sharper result, or we can change the distance of the bump node. Here's an example of how that white noise texture node looks. I hope this video gave you some insight on how to start texturing in Blender, and I look forward to seeing you in the next series where we'll discuss rendering techniques.